welcome to another episode of A Questioning Mind. I'm your host, Sagarika, and today I'm joined by Akshobh. Akshobh Giridhardas is somebody who's been on the channel with us before. He wears many hats. Akshobh, very welcome to the channel again.
Sagarika, pleasure to be here with you, and thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you for your time today morning. Akshobh is joining us from Washington, D.C. He's based there. And Akshobh, you wear too many hats, all right? You've been a former consultant with the World Bank. You've been a TEDx speaker. You host a podcast. You work on international relations policies. So why don't you tell the viewers a little more about all the things that you do?
Yeah, thanks, Sagarika. Many hats for a very limited head, perhaps. I'm currently a visiting fellow with the Observer Research Foundation. Of course, there's an America chapter, but I'm more affiliated with the chapter in India. I head comms for a U.S.-India trade advocacy group. I am also, a journalist by my past life, as I like to call it, because it feels like what I call the BC era, before COVID era, very long time ago. And I say now I'm in DC during COVID. uh, the joke works only in Washington. So I used to be a journalist with Channel News Asia, covering business and international news, all of it in Singapore. And then even before that, even before my past life, I was a sports broadcast journalist with ESPN Star Sports. So a very long time ago. But yeah, and I write op-eds on the side for various publications, and write about stuff that I love talking about right here. So it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for having me.
Of course. So it's the op-ed that you mentioned that I'd really like to discuss today. One of them that you wrote most recently for Money Control was pretty great and covers one of the topics I've been wanting to discuss on the channel since it happened. So this is a very interesting situation where it's not just about Saudi Arabia and Iran getting together. It's just that they've been brought together by an unlikely player in the world of geopolitics. It's China. When the rest of the world is focused on the things that China's doing wrong, China goes and gets Iran and Saudi Arabia together. So I'm going to link this article down in the description box for those who have not read it yet. But it's an amazing article, and you should definitely give it a read. It's also written very well, typical Akshobh style. So let's get into it. Why don't we start with a little bit of the history between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and why this is such a big development?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first context that people forget or remember is, yes, both Iran and Saudi Arabia are in the Middle East, separated by a very narrow strip with the Persian Gulf. Of course, when I was in Qatar a few months ago, and I asked someone, is that the Persian Gulf? And they pointed out, they're like, Habibi, we call it the Arabian Gulf here. So that's again a caveat reminder. But the most important thing that people, then I've seen a lot of Western commentators sometimes get this wrong inadvertently, is Iran, of course, is not Arab, it's Persian, because, well, partly because to be identified as an Arab state, you have to oneself identify as Arab and Arab state, and secondly, you have to speak Arabic, and the Iranians speak Farsi. But what fundamentally you have to understand Iran, you have to go back. We can go back to 53 when Mohammad Mossadegh was the last independently elected leader of Iran, and of course a coup d'etat that was hatched by the British and the Americans to oust him after decided to naturalize Iran's oil fields, and British Petroleum lost. So talk about MI6, talk about CIA. Obviously, the movie Argo is based on true stories, and that shows you some snippets of what happened. And when Mossadegh was ousted in 53, that was replaced by the Shah of Iran, Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was, liked by Western leaders. Was seen as, very liberal, was or wanted to modernize Iran. A lot of times, if you look at old footage of Iran, of course, this is before you and I were born, from the 60s and 70s. It was a very liberal state. It would, it seemed very Western in some ways if you look at people on the beaches. But what gradually also happened is that the Shah also was very dictatorial. He had Savak, a secret police force, a very authoritarian. And of course, with every kingdom or monarchy, there is a sense of opulence and grandiosity, and that was there. The Shah and his wife was seen as bougie and out of touch. And but even during that period, there are a few things important to understand. One is Iran and the United States were allies or had relations. Iran was actually only the second Muslim country, not Arab country, to recognize Israel, which today you would think are Iran's seen as Israel's biggest threat. Because I think after Egypt and Nasser helped the thawing, what happened also was Iran came and recognized Israel before I think even Jordan. And what eventually happened over a period of time was um, things start to simmer, right? Things start to simmer. It's very good until it's not, and things hit a crescendo, and the Black Swan event happened, and that is shortly afterwards, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was ousted and was in Paris in exile, then was in Iraq, decided to start the revolution gradually, and then things started to boil over. And I think the crescendo really happened when you know the embassy in Israel, the embassy of Israel in Tehran was attacked, and the U.S. embassy in Tehran, which we remember in 1979, seminal moments. The students barged in, took hostages. Of course, some escaped out, and which we've captured in Argo. And but even during the time when the Shah of Iran was there, things were okay, but not okay with Saudi and Iran, partly because what the kingdom. This is where it's important to understand. The family of the family in Saudi Arabia, our House of Saud, has always had a form of interpretation of Islam that's Wahhabism, as we've seen in some of the more rigid aspects that have kind of been codified in the kingdom, and the Shah's Iran's benevolence or westernization was sort of heresy, as I say. It juxtaposed what they believe in, but it wasn't as antagonist. Now, what happens from the Ayatollah regime, which has now been over 40 years from Khomeini to Khamenei, you've seen the IRGC come about, which is, of course, is larger than ever. But the two fundamental facts that happen is Iran and Saudi Arabia are at loggerheads, because one is Khomeini wanted to do something that made him see, like, that Iran is the representation of the Islamic world, and the two dominant sects, Sunni and Shia, are epitomized in Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran, of course, being Shia, and Saudi Arabia being Sunni, and we've sectarian violence across the Christianity faith, been Catholic and Protestant, and Shia and Sunni has been well evinced across the globe. But this is sort of where the bifurcation happens, and gradually there's a form of very, very strict dogma that gets played out in Iran. The Khomeini regime, the Ayatollah regime, and the subsequent leaders that been anointed after that all have a very strict interpretation of that, and Iran all of a sudden ceases to have relations with the United States and Israel. United States been called as Big Satan, Israel's called Little Satan, and of course, right now, if you just think about where Iran stands, its adversaries are not one, two, three. It's very, very difficult. There's the United States, which is not easy to have an adversary. To have as an adversary. There is Israel again, which of course is even though much smaller than Iran in size, but military technological know-how has been far ahead of the game. Case in point, just see how Israel's deep intelligence, deep state works in Iran, and of course Saudi Arabia right across there. And that's sort of where I want to leave it before I get to your next question of where Iran and Saudi Arabia, and why the last Cold War that was contested, or Cold War as we call it, because of what we've seen for many years in the region and how that plays out.
Right. So the modern history of Iran as such, thanks for that. I do think that the fact that Iran remains less affected by the US and Israel, despite all of the sanctions and their coverage in terms of intelligence, is not the best. Even though Soleimani was killed, it's not as immense as it. You'd think that a country that counts Israel and USA both amongst its adversaries would face. So it's done reasonably okay on that front, on its national security front. So I think it's a little bit hard to penetrate into Iran and get on the ground information out from. Although now we see again something that seems very organic in that in the women revolting against forced hijab. So there is that news. But yes, the fact that they're both the Shia and Sunni powerheads and the center of religion for each of these sects makes them both want to be hegemons for their communities or for the larger Islamic community across the world. So it's actually an understandable Cold War, so to speak. So, how did the actual situation of their and being not very friendly come about in recent times? What was the latest infraction? And which brings us, which would then I'd like to check you into what this actually means, like for somebody with so much history, for two countries with so much history, bad blood between them, what it means to have them work together now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think recent history is a key word, because we can, we've done
Yeah, we
prehistory
all have
53, we've done the 79
extremely
history.
long histories for both of them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, let's start with 2016, right? Like in 2016, you've had the assassination in Saudi Arabia. I mean, but public assassinations, to be fair, have been seen both in Iran and in Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia. Of course, when Nimir, a very popular Shia cleric, was assassinated in 2016, this, of course, as I say, lit fires in Iran, and quite literally lit fires in Iran, as this time the Saudi embassy in Tehran was set ablaze. So you've seen the Israeli embassy in the past attacked in Tehran, the American embassy, and now the Saudi embassy as well. And as a result of this, the Iran and Saudi Arabia tensions really, really, absolutely came to loggerheads, to a point that they both ceased diplomatic relations, which Iran, of course, does not have with Israel, does not have with the United States since '79, and that was, of course, seen as a very direct threat to Iran when a top prominent Shia cleric was assassinated. It's not just
Mm.
the Saudis doing what the Saudis do. Sometimes this was seen as a direct affront to Iran. And as a result of it, that's why the subsequent backlash happened. So this is where
Mm.
things between Riyadh and Tehran start to spiral. And I mean spiral as the downward decline starts to happen. But of course, what's been happening in the backdrop that really pushed it up front is to understand that what Iran's had since Ayatollah Khomeini came, because there was a particular instance that you have to remember, is when Salman Rushdie was satanic was given a fatwa. He was not by India or some the Sunni Islamic world. It was actually by the Khomeini. And
Right.
why would Khomeini care necessarily about a British Indian author? Of course, yes, he wrote things that was seen as reviled ad nauseum to some of the more theological scholars. But this was also a sense of trying to get relevance in the Islamic world, vying for that, because we've known about Mecca, the centrality of Islam, Mecca and Medina, which of course are in Saudi Arabia. So how does Iran and Tehran try to vie away that? How do you wrest that away? I mean, imagine if there was another Catholic state today that wanted to vie away
Mhm.
centrality from the Pope or the Vatican. What do you do? I mean, I want to caveat, I'm not a theological scholar. I'm just
Sure.
pointing out things I've read and things that other scholars have pointed out. So Iran has obviously long tried for dominance in the region, right? And of course,
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia has the GCC, which is different from the Levant, and Iran and Iraq are not part of that. And there's Saudi centrality in the GCC, but partly for many, many years, the United States, and don't forget, Iran and the United States have not just have no diplomatic relations, but they have the worst sense of relations in no diplomacy as well. It's not like we're going to try and talk to see where we can have
Mhm.
rapprochements, almost very adversarial and antagonistic. And meanwhile,
Right.
it goes another end where the United States for long has Saudi Arabia has, a very, very strong ally. And this, of course, was largely the energy economy, the petrodollar, access to the Middle East, having, a Sunni client state, I mean, or Sunni ally that assuages that. Because terrorism didn't exactly start with 9/11. It happened many times before that, but just 9/11 codified global terrorism, codified the war on terror, and just made it a very household item that for people in the West that may not have only assumed terrorism is something dystopic. Obviously, growing up in the subcontinent, we've seen that far and far beyond, to the point that 9/11 wasn't a, a, necessarily a new phenomenon. It was a new phenomenon globally. But where I was going with this is there was also the relation with Saudi Arabia. There was a military relationship. There was the energy economy, the energy dependency, and as a result of it, the lacuna between Iran and Saudi Arabia grew further and further wide. And Iran's been constantly vying for dominance in the region. So what happens there is we go to what's called the Cold War, and the reason, of course, we know it's called a Cold War. The most phenomenal term that's coined for it is because 70 odd years of two power blocks going up against each other without having armed conflict. But another sacrosanctity of what a Cold War is use proxies, whether it's the Viet Cong in Vietnam, North and South Korea, Contra rebels in Nicaragua. The US and USSR had power blocks, Warsaw Pact, NATO, various deals, and of course that's of course India's story of being non-aligned. Now, within the Middle Eastern world, there are various elements that play a part in this. One, of course, is wherever there's been dystopia, both Saudi and Iran each sees the other as a hostile actor, detrimental to their influence, their philosophy. But what they both forget that they have done is they both have acted as agents of chaos. They have sowed a lot of seeds that have completely toppled the stability of the region. And don't forget, Middle East has always been a tinderbox, and Saudi and Iran have, along with Western powers, have only lit matches in gasoline-soaked ropes. So just hitting the high notes here. In Lebanon, don't forget, Iran has built up the Hezbollah, which is a Shiite paramilitary force. Assad, of course, an Alawite, but has close relations with Iran. The Saudi family, that's of course in Syria, but it just finished in Lebanon. The Hezbollah is funded by IRGC, received patronage from the Iran state, whereas Lebanon has been with the Hariri family has been historically close to the Saudis, and we know about the recent history. Not to get too much into it as well. Also, fundamentally, is what we have to understand with that is if you go to Syria as well, where the real chaos has just been it's been accentuated since since Syria got out of control. There's the Assad family, which is of course has also Assad's father himself was in charge, which are Alawites, but they have received patronage from the Iranian state. The Saudis back Sunni rebels, militia rebels fighting Assad's family, and of course there's ISIS that everyone wants to fight because it's a caliphate and very extreme in a lot of ways. And of course there is Russia, China, the United States, all having a stake in it. So Saudi is a very beg your pardon, Syria is a very complicated tinderbox, but Yemen is sort of where that has completely been in disarray, and it's in all the indexes from World Bank's index, and
Right.
it's absolutely at the nadir. And of course, Iran backs the Houthi rebels, which of course have even and because Saudi share the border with Iran, the Houthi have fired missiles targeting Saudi oil fields, which Riyadh says is akin to war. Tehran, of course, publicly denies involvement, but Iran does back the Houthis and Saudis back the government. So it's very interesting to note, Sagarika, how they swap. When one backs the government, the other backs the adversary. And you saw this in 2011 during the Arab Spring as well. Yeah, I mean, we saw it started in Egypt, that splintered all over to Libya, to Tunisia. But in Tunisia, the Saudis backed, backed the government because they were also fearful of the Arab Spring getting out of control. And at some point, what comes knocking on your door, right? So, and Tehran, of course, also act like an agent of chaos, is trying to topple the regimes across the region, because don't forget it's also an asymmetry of Sunni and Shias in terms of the faith that they follow, right? So there have been more predominantly Sunni states, and of course Sunni states do point the compass towards Mecca, literally and metaphorically, in terms of just geopolitically as well. So Iran wants Iran friendly governments, right? So even though Hamas is not exactly aligned on Shiite ideology, but given Israel is such an adversary to Iran, and Hamas has been declared a terror group and operates from Gaza on the other side of the West Bank, on the Mediterranean, which of course is blockaded and seen as an open air prison. They receive patronage from Iran, and of course Hamas fires rockets into Israel. Israel has the Iron Dome, but Tehran fights multiple pronged wars. It's not just Saudi Arabia. There's another conflict with Israel. There's another conflict with Saudi as well. And I'll get into where we see Israel and Saudi Arabia. But I think this just setting the scene of what we're seeing in the region, or what we have seen rather.
Right. For the viewers, I would suggest actually just going and reading also a little bit of the article, because Akshobh just went through a lot of history and wars and conflicts in the region, and it can be a little bit too much for somebody unfamiliar with the subject.
I
So,
apologize for the brain dump.
no, no, absolutely, it's necessary. It's just that it is, there's quite a lot that's always going on in the region, and should this development of them finally reopening, restarting diplomatic relationships, how does China fit into all of this? Like, of course, they've got their own interests, but and we'll come to Syria as well. So,
Yeah, no, and thank you. I think that's a very important thing. Now, I think since the Cold War, we've seen a bipolar world. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed and splintered into the various Soviet blocs, splintered into various countries in Central Asia and Eastern Europe and the Russian state. Um, it was declared as a victory for both capitalism, Western ideology, unipolar world, and what I think India has also spoken about recently is a multipolar world, a multipolarity. Whereas the world economy has changed, right? As I said, I used to be a consultant with the World Bank, and I was there for a meeting yesterday. And you keep seeing pictures of Keynes all over, and the 1945 and Bretton Woods system. And apart from that being very important for the global monetary system and how the dollar eventually became the reserve currency of the world, what that really showed is who had the institutions, and largely Washington-led institutions in the World Bank and IMF and the UN headquarters being in New York City, and just the cloud, the global cloud. Like even right now, in India, there's a sense of euphoria and Mr. Ajay Banga being nominated, but that's also important to understand that the United States, with a handshake deal with Europe, appoints the World Bank president who's American, and Europe appoints and the IMF president who's European.
Mm,
AKA David Malpass, the outgoing president, and Christine Lagarde, the IMF president. So what happens here is there was an asymmetry of economic wealth, and who owns the coffers sets the policy. And just we have to kind of go back. U.S.-China relations, we could be all day long, from the good, the bad, the ugly, from the
yeah.
the Nixon Kissinger détente to the Trump Xi trade wars that we've seen. And um, what you have to kind of understand here is uh, China, America's had many adversaries in the past, right?
Mm,
Uh, right from fighting the British Empire to the founding fathers of America to gain independence, right from having the Spanish American Wars, right from disagreement with say the French on something. They've had adversaries in Imperial Japan, right? Case in point, World War II. They have had disagreements with Nazi Germany, obviously. Case in point, World War II again. And of course, the Soviet Union, right? One of the biggest adversaries. America's had adversaries. But the fundamental difference to understand with China and the United States is none of those adversaries have done what China has done. That's
mm, mm,
60% of US GDP, owns majority US bonds, and threatening to displace Washington's place in the pantheon of
right.
higher echelons of superpowers. Right? China may not be G7, but it is a G2 when it comes to the United States.
Mm,
And furthermore, and also outdoing the United States in place in Latin America, in Africa, having client states. Of course, we can get into the debt trap diplomacy with
sure.
Belt and Road Initiative. But what you have to understand here is that there has been a concerted worry in obviously because the United States and China don't have the same ideology and political
Mm,
ideology, diplomatic ideology, but China has been ahead on some of the tech game, particularly in the AI race and the drone technology as well, which and as a result of which has splintered into new initiatives such as the Indo-Pacific Quad and I2U2, which I still think is a very very terrible acronym, but these little mini laterals that have come about, right, which are not exactly Asian NATOs or Western Middle Eastern
sure.
NATOs. What they are uh, economic incentives to other client states with a sense of precluding a geopolitical hegemon. Now, China, of course, is the largest importer, and it dependent on Saudi Arabia and Iran, both for its oil economy as well, and of course has formed along with India, which is buying one of the largest importers and buying stuff from Russia right now. So is China. But what China realizes is that Iran's an antagonist for Saudi Arabia, Iran's an antagonist for the US, and um, those sticks that Iran gets dealt with are carrots for
Mm,
China, right? I mean, Moscow and Beijing have very good convivial relations with Iran, and because I think the temptation of an American adversary is only an incentive to have forge bonhomie and economic relations. So, in
sure.
Iran and China have signed the 25-year strategic agreement, which of course means the deep sea ports. We talk about Gwadar and Chabahar, as we've seen in
Mm,
Pakistan and Iran, and and Iran has a very central part in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which of course is very nebulous and involves roads, ports, infrastructure, rail,
mm,
and uh, but where the fundamental difference is two things. One is, as I mentioned, whoever had the institutions, which was largely Washington based. China has AAIB, which is trying to counter the World Bank led initiative,
mm,
which China has leading the SCO, trying to create a Central Asian, country initiative. There was BRICS, which of course is a little more nebulous, but largely China is one of the top five players in it because
Mm.
five-player country, and it was one where involved the global South a little more. So China's setting its own agenda in some ways, but it's trying to also pick up the vacuum that the United States has left off. That is, the United States is focused on containing on a Beijing containment strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. It's focused on a little bit of I2 U2 in West Asia, but not enough. It's
Mm.
focused on Eastern Europe with the Russia-Ukraine war that's going on as we speak. But China really wanted to pick up the pieces, and fundamentally, America can't be in this room because given that
Right.
Iran and Washington, Tehran and Washington don't have any relations, so
Mm.
that's sort of where China's played peacemaker. Because largely, what Washington would do, and I mentioned this in the article, was the Oslo Accords, right? Israel and Palestine, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat both passed on. Um, trying to build a sense of rapprochement. And Beijing's doing that, the Washington consensus, to use a poor pun,
Mm.
but also trying to fill the gap that Washington left behind. And fundamentally, this is the most important thing that I think I've added in the article, is Beijing doesn't have the historical baggage in the
Mm.
region that Western powers have had.
True.
Not the
True.
United States, but colonial powers in Britain and France. I mean, don't forget the Balfour Declaration was part of, if you go into the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict,
Mm.
largely out of its stemmed from the Balfour Declaration. And after the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the region, Britain and France carved up the region and
Yeah.
almost bartered system it with each other. And what China says, look, we don't have that historical baggage, right? And fundamentally, unlike the United States, they don't have to coalesce on political ideology, right? I mean, one of the reasons we talk about India and the United States having very convivial relations is shared democratic values. And that's never been a concern for China as well, because China's silent messaging to the room is, yeah, we have an ideology that Washington doesn't agree with. So we don't care about your form of Wahhabism, your form of Shia theocracy, but you want roads, railways, ports, infrastructures? Here's Belt and Road Initiative. Let's have a mutual thing. And I think Tehran, particularly, and along with Riyadh now, have been able to see that as a sense of, there's a sense of Beijing's own form of economic pragmatism that really works well. So that I think has added to the has led to propitious time for Beijing to be able to come in and facilitate this agreement. And I think that is where we are right now in that front.
Mm. Mm. It's extremely interesting from an energy perspective, considering like one is, I mean, energy is later. Of course, the geopolitical considerations go way beyond it, but also, do you see Saudi Arabia kind of uh, moving on from the friendship that they've enjoyed traditionally with the US since the last few decades?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Sagarika, because for a very long time, Riyadh and Washington have walked
Mm.
lockstep in foreign policy, right? And and you would think this is like, there are reasons, as you mentioned, like, a gateway to the Middle East, needing not just a Sunni Islamic client, but the largest one, plus the petrodollar. I mean, don't forget where the oil economy was in the 70s, long before the US had its own shale economy. There was there was a sense of dependence on the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia is still one of the largest, OPEC producing nations. Um, there is there were a lot of fissures that could have happened. One is, of course, don't forget, Osama bin Laden is, the son of a Saudi business magnate. 15 of the 19, I guess, 20 hijackers in 9/11 were from were Saudi nationalities,
Probably.
or the other ones had nationalities attached close to Saudi, like Egypt and Kuwait
Mm.
and Jamal Khashoggi. Don't forget the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, which of course is the most morbid assassination recorded. It was obviously in Turkey, but it was well known how higher up this goes and who
Right.
ordered it and how they were very close to the regime. But even then, this did not come.
None of that broke the
None of that
friendship.
broke.
Right?
None of that broke. And I remember writing at that point, and I live in Washington, D.C., and I
Mm.
lived very close to Saudi embassy at one point, and I joked that from my window I could see the juxtaposition of good and evil. I thought there was Saudi embassy, there was Kennedy Performing Arts Center, and there was Watergate. So,
Yeah.
all in one row. On the other side, there was State Department. So it was a very, very interesting view. And there was a road here called Jamal Khashoggi Road shortly afterwards.
Mm.
And the house I was staying at was very close to George Washington University, where a friend of mine came across a classmate with the name Khashoggi, and he asked "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear. What's, is it a common
Mhm.
last name?" And he's like, "He was my uncle, right?" So, and
Oh.
the Saudi embassy was protected, and there was no. I'm sure there were protests, but no protests. But I was just thinking, had this been Tehran and the Trump administration with someone like Bolton, I think was NSA at that time, if there would have been hawkishness
Mm.
to another level. I don't want to predict U.S. foreign policy at that stage, but
Mm.
imagine if Tehran had a hand in something like this, there would be no respite spared. But it did not break Saudi relations, as you said. If anything, it just continued, and
Mm.
um, so for Saudi to now sign a deal, well, of course, Saudi is thinking about it from its own perspective with Tehran, right? But an American adversary, two American adversaries, Tehran and Beijing. I mean, Beijing,
Mm.
of course, was
Mm.
the convener of this. It is. I wouldn't say fissures, but it's definitely a different period because we also noticed the relation with MBS and Biden has not been the best. And
Yes.
since MBS, a very young crown prince, that when he was, anointed to the top echelons, there's been both a sense of trying to rapidly modernize Saudi with this new mega cities. And I was
Mm.
in the Middle East recently, in UAE and Qatar, and everyone's talking about architecture. Friends are talking about wanting to get this project in Saudi and Nome and all this cities that he's having in World Economic Forum. They own the club Newcastle United, and
Mm.
don't forget the Qataris set president in PSG, and the Emiratis sent president by owning the Etihad Stadium in
Mm.
Manchester City. So the Saudis are like, hang on a minute, the Qataris and the Emiratis are in, we need to come in as well. And it's now become the playground for which oligarch or which kingdom and monarchy owns what football team. Uh, since then, there's a sense of modernization, but there's also a sense of hawkishness that we've seen.
Mm.
One with, we've seen with Jamal Khashoggi, with things that the kingdom finds very sacrosanct to itself. I mean, because Jamal Khashoggi was not just a Washington Post journalist, he was also a Saudi dissident, that is Saudi national who was
Mm.
sitting overseas and critiquing the monarchy and the kingdom. And that, of course, we know is very heresy in the Islamic and in Saudi Arabia's entire intellectual and political
Honestly, in
ideology.
a lot of monarchies, it's just the system is like that, right? You can't really say anything about the Thai king either.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. I was going to say Thailand's a good example as well. I mean, you've read reports of a brother turning another brother as well. I mean, King Bhumibol when he was around. I mean, and Thailand would be far from any conservative. I mean, if
Mm.
anything, I mean, people go to Thailand to get away from their sultry lives and enjoy the beaches. So it's far from what you would see there. But
Mm.
which also shows it's not just a religious doctrine, but it's a sense of a monarchy's conservatism in
Mm.
however they perceive it, whatever people perceive as a threat to their power. Uh, so on that note, right? So this is the thing between Biden and MBS have been fairly tepid. It's the US not want to suddenly cut off ties. I mean, case in point, Pakistan has been a ally. I mean, for
Yep.
since Ayub Khan ingratiated, or
Mm.
maybe the early 50s. But even after Bin Laden raid, there's I mean, it's frosty allies. It's allies on paper, but there's no real warm diplomatic relationships. And while India and the United States don't have a formal alliance, because India and the United States are just strategic partners, but that relationship has grown leaps and bounds from zero military sales to $20 billion, having deals like not just the NSSP led to the civil nuclear deal, which led to Obama terming India the major defense partner, to coalescing in the Quad and the Indo-Pacific, and also um, the ISET, which is, of course, we've seen just a few months ago, which, of course,
Mm.
is where it is. But I segue too much, so I'm going to move away from the subcontinent back
So,
to the East.
yeah, sorry. I just want to bring in, with regards to US-Saudi relations, I kind of find it interesting that this one is a little bit more obvious. This move makes things a little bit more obvious because the energy, due to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, even with regards to oil production, we've seen Saudi being rather ignorant, rather negligent about US requirements from them. And this has been going on since about at least a few months, but mostly about a year and a half, with them cutting, slashing prices, and then not meeting requirements, energy requirements for the US. So, and there's been a sense of we have our own interests, which was never actually the case. It was more like they were very much, like you said, in lockstep with the US previously. And now going all the way up to this diplomacy with Iran, with China in the center, does it signal something more?
Yeah, I mean, look, well, of course, the Saudi dependence has also changed because it's where the world has moved in the sector, right? I mean, we're trying to cut down on oil and fossil fuels and coal. I mean, to clean energy, to
Mm,
renewables, biofuels, and ethanol, and where
true.
going talking about EVs, and and some point EV jets, which I hope does not run
Mm,
out of charge because it'll just might just fall in the ocean. But facetious aside, it's also reducing dependence, and plus US increasing its own dependence on shale, and it's that energy economy dictated geopolitical hegemons. It dictated where the Overton window for
mm,
tolerance lay. And I think that's been pulling back. That's gradually weaned away as we've gone to a sense of clean energy space. So I think the clean energy space has played a part in geopolitical hegemons. In terms of what Saudi is doing, is look, there are two things to importance here, and I know of time is of the essence. I want to hit the high notes very quickly. Saudi relations Iran, yes, were important, but also it wasn't a major reset the way, say, an
no, of
Iran
course.
US
Right.
relation was. It was less than a decade. It was very hostilities, and that's why I
Mm,
call it a thawing in the desert. Both the pun of ice thawing in a very hot place,
mm,
but
mm,
it was a tinderbox. It was just it was a hot region, and the smallest of things could spiral across control. And what China also saw is, look, there's already energy prices that have gone through the roof with the Russia-Ukraine war. There's a food crisis happening. There is a logistic supply chain. The last thing you need is another region going up, because that will spiral world economies. Because
mm,
the
mm,
global economy is not just isolated right now. So the global economy is the world's largest mutual fund. Everyone has a
mm.
right. There's
Right.
more than the others, and what we're seeing right now is, when there was sense of rapprochement with Iran, when Obama wanted the JCPOA, because Iran's nuclear program is seen as a threat for Israel.
Mm,
Saudi saw it as a threat. The Americans see it as a threat. Other Gulf states, Sunni states, are seen as a threat. So what's important right now was a rapprochement with Iran. Netanyahu and Likud party in Israel didn't like it. The Saudis did not like it. In fact, I spent some time in Palestine, in Israel and Palestine, and I remember going to the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And that time, I think her title was assistant to the head of European Affairs in the Palestinian Ministry, and she had said that the Saudis have completely been derelict on the Palestinian cause. Even though
mm.
Saudi and Iran, one thing they coalesce on is a
Right.
two-state solution, and which
Right.
which even India has as foreign policy,
Mm,
is partly because Iran was so hawkish that and we've seen many reports, even though Saudi and Israel don't have any formal relations, like the way the Abraham Accords codified relations with UAE and Bahrain
mm,
and
mm,
other Middle Eastern states, Sudan and Morocco.
mm,
What you have right now was, there were a lot of other secret meetings between MBS and BBE, and
mm,
visits that were reported to Saudi, and the flights, El Al flight, being allowed to use Saudi airspace. So people saw it only as a matter of time when the Abraham Accords were signed, that Saudi will normalize relations. There'll be a whole gateway for Israel and Saudi business transactions, like the way there is now between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv. But this means that the Overton window might not have just shifted to diplomacy yet with Israel, because
mm.
apart from the United States, maybe, I think Israel would not have been happy with it, because Israel
Right.
fundamentally does see the nuclear program as an existential threat. So,
Mm.
Sagarika, I hope we've kind of covered the high notes.
Yes, I think that's been quite illuminating on several fronts. Well, this is actually a very interesting, complicated but interesting subject, and I really appreciated your article on this. I'm going to again link it down in the description box. And yeah, I look forward to the developments, considering, now Syria, the Assad was visiting the Saudi Arabian kingdom as well. So let's see how it goes, and we'll see the Middle Eastern region continue to do what they do best, keep everyone on their tiptoes. And yeah, I also found China being at the center of this very interesting. I'm not quite sure what it signals for global geopolitics at this point, but it's one of the first times in recent times that they've really stepped up and taken that initiative. So, well, thank you so much for all of your inputs. It's been very interesting, and I love that you have all of this information on top of your head and you can just like flow with it. So, this is very helpful, and I'm sure the viewers had a lot to learn from it. Thank you, and I look forward to connecting again.
Thank you, Sagarika. Really, pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, and we'll chat again soon.
Sure. Thanks, Akshobh.